Welcome to Wadsworth History on Film, a program presented by the Wadsworth Area Historical Society and designed to give an oral history of Wadsworth for posterity. I'm Cesar Carino, your host, and our guest today is Kenneth Flood. Kenneth, I've never called you Kenneth in my life.
Always.
Always Kenny, that's right. And I probably have known you as long as I've known any other living person in Wadsworth because we were neighbors somewhat many, many years ago.
True.
You came, you weren't necessarily born in Wadsworth, but you've been here for about 78 years, I believe. I think you said.
That's true.
78 years. Now, you were born where, Kenny?
I was born in Akron on Princeton Street.
Princeton Street in Akron. And then where did you do? Did you stay there in Princeton?
Then we stayed, then we moved to Russell Avenue in Akron.
And then you had one of your sisters was born.
My sister Mary was
Sister
born.
Mary. What year would that have been?
Well, she's 2 years younger than I am, so it'd be 1916.
16. So she's about 81 years old now, and you're 83 years old. And then where did you move from Russell Avenue?
Then we moved to Kenmore on Oregon Avenue in Kenmore.
Oregon Avenue. And somebody was born there too, right? A sister was born there.
My sister Betty.
Betty. What year would that have been?
Well, that would have been just before we moved to Wadsworth. Or no, it would have been a little bit after we moved to Wadsworth, not too many days afterward.
She was born in Wadsworth then?
No, I got that mixed up. It was, we came to Wadsworth in 1919.
1919.
And I was 5 years old, so Betty had been born. I get kind of confused there because she was born on May the 5th. And I can't say whether she was born now in Kenmore or Wadsworth.
Well, it was close enough though.
Because I remember we moved here on the 1st of May.
1st of May of 1919.
1919.
So you've been here 78 full years.
Yeah. And on the 5th of May, we had a big snow.
In May?
In May.
Wow.
And we had a maiden blush apple tree out in the front yard. You don't hear of them anymore. And the blossoms were out. And by noon, all the snow was gone.
Warm enough so that it melted.
Yes, it melted right away.
Yeah, of course it would in May, because that's pretty warm in May. Now, where did you live in Wadsworth? Where did you move to in Wadsworth?
Well, we lived in Silver Creek there till my folks lived there. I was married when I was 25, and my folks moved up to
King Street.
King Street. And then later on, they bought the old Hunt property on Pardee Street.
In Pardee.
On Pardee.
Now, we need to get a little bit about your background here because you have on both sides, both your side and your wife's side, there's some real history here in Wadsworth. Let's take you first, then we'll go to Ruth, your wife. She was a Bergner, right?
Yes, sir.
And the Bergners lived south of Wadsworth on, where did they live?
They lived down on the corner of Pine and Main Street.
They were an old family in Wadsworth too, weren't they?
No. Ruth was 11 years old when they moved to Wadsworth.
Oh, is that right? Because the reason that I say that is that her sister Donna Bergner was the superintendent's secretary for years and years, and just about everyone who went through Wadsworth High School knew her.
That's right.
And I thought that they had lived here all their lives. But let's get back to Kenny Flood and Silver Creek.
All right.
What is happening right now where you once lived?
Well, after the first year, my dad started raising berries, strawberries and raspberries.
Mhm.
And then I didn't go to school till the following year. I would be 6 years old. And then when I was 8 years old, I took on passing papers.
Delivering papers. What was it, the Beacon Journal or the Akron Times-Press at those days?
Well, it was the Beacon Journal, the Akron Times, and the Akron Press.
Oh, I see. All three of them. There were three papers at the time.
Yes,
And then didn't the Times and the Press combine to make it the Akron Times-Press?
that's true. Then they took the route away from me. They asked me what I wanted to pass, and I said, I'll take the Beacon. So a fellow by the name of Harold Henchy,
Harold Henchy. I know Harold. Mhm.
he was the one that took over the Times Press.
Mhm. The Henchys lived in Silver Creek too, didn't they?
No,
Or was it west of Silver Creek?
it was west of Silver
Right.
Creek,
Mhm.
up on Bird Street.
On Bird Street.
Up-
And they had mules or something, didn't they?
No, Fred had a beautiful set of horses.
Horses.
A team of horses.
Team of horses. Mhm.
And
Fred
he-
Henchy did.
Yes. And he used to haul coal down to the old XL rubber
Which
company.
the XL rubber is now the Barefoot Sole, or whatever they call it today. They've changed that so many times down through there. I think it's Eggleston,
Well, it was the Chemetex.
Chemetex. Mhm.
And then he would bring in coal with his team. And he was a big man, strong man.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
And he had a shovel there that I couldn't begin to lift the coal that he
But he
did.
could do it.
He could.
He was strong. I know that he had the reputation for being very, very strong. Old
He
Fred.
was.
Mhm. Now he had a fairly large family. Do you remember some of the members of his family?
Well, he had I remember Harold,
Mm-hmm.
and then he had another boy, I forget his name, and he had a daughter.
Was that Julia?
I forget her name,
Mm-hmm.
but then he had an older daughter, and I'm trying to think who she married.
Well, it'll come to you in a couple of minutes, I'm sure, when you're not thinking of it. Right now it's hard to think of it. You passed the paper route where and what homes? And there weren't too many homes in Silver Creek at that time, were there?
No, there was, I can start from the Akron Road, or the old 224.
But they called it the Akron Road at that time.
And I didn't pass papers up there, but there was a house on the corner where the gas station
Right.
was.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Right in the corner of Silver Creek and Broad, there was a big house there. Mm-hmm.
And there was a fellow by the name of Bert Patterson and his wife lived there, and they worked for Ed Long.
Who was right next door.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew the Longs very well. And then down the road about, well, better than a half mile, we lived.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And then you went on down the road, on the left-hand side was Colin Brown.
Colin Brown, where Margaret Rich lives right now.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side was the Yockey family,
The Yockey family. They actually built the farm, didn't they?
the Newt Yockey farm.
Newt
But
Yockey.
no, it was built by his father and mother.
Oh, his father, but the Yockeys built the farm.
Yes. And
Tell us about Newt Yockey and that farm. Can you tell us more about that? Because that's extremely interesting.
Well, Grandma Yockey lived there, and she had a little place of her own.
Kind of a little summer house, wasn't it?
No, it was
No?
attached to the house.
Was it? Mm-hmm.
And Grandpa Yockey, when we moved there, was ill and he was in bed.
Okay. Do you remember Grandpa Yaki's first name and Grandma Yaki's first name?
No, I don't. I always call them Grandpa and Grandma.
Even though they weren't your grandparents, right?
Right.
But this was Newt Yaki, who was the son who was building, who was actually there.
Yes, he was doing the farming.
The farm was started the barn was built in 1893. It's torn down now. There's a housing allotment there, but it was born in 1893.
That's right.
As a matter of fact, the barn it was probably right on the location of where Meadow and Robin Drive converge right now. That's a big housing allotment. And then the farm itself is now the Wintergreen allotment, which has about a couple hundred homes in it. But when we were growing up, that was nothing but a big farm. So then you went down from, this is 19, how old, what year would this have been that you were delivering papers?
Well, it'd be 22.
1922. So now you went south from the Brown house, which is now the Margaret Rich house, and there was an open field, is that correct?
Right.
And whom did that belong to?
That belonged to Willard Hollinger
Well,
and Aaron Hollinger.
Aaron, but Willard didn't build a house there until 1926.
That's right.
So when you were passing papers, there was not a house there, is that
No.
correct?
Uh-uh.
Then you go over the railroad track,
And there was Aaron Hollinger.
Aaron Hollinger way back in off the lane about 1,000 feet or so.
Yes.
Keep on going south, and who else was living there?
The next house was Omri Parson.
Omride Parson. And do you remember the next one?
The next house, the people lived there shortly. I didn't pass the paper to them, but I forget their name, but then a family of Andersons moved in there.
Andersons.
And then on the corner was Bill Halvey.
Bill Halvey.
He only had one arm, and Bill would, he had two sons. The one son was George, and the other son was Bill. And Bill was blind.
Bill Halvey, the junior, was blind.
He was blind. He worked at the match shop, and there were a group of them, of the men down there, not a group, I don't know how many there were, but they were mixing up chemicals down there for 4th of July. And the chemicals exploded and blinded Bill.
Oh, boy.
And George, he worked at the match shop, and he fooled around with crystal sets, and he had one of the first crystal sets around here.
Oh, is that right?
And I remember I used to go in there, and it would squawk and everything, and finally he would get a message, you know. So then I didn't pass the papers on up over the hill.
Now, when you say the house on the corner where the Halveys lived, that's the house at Silver Creek and Johnson Road right now. What about across the street, the farm there, across the road from there?
Well, while I was passing my papers, I went to the left.
You went to the left, east
up
on
over
Johnson
the hill,
Road.
and that was Mackey.
Mackey.
Bob Mackey
Bob
lived
Mackey.
there.
Now, Bob Mackey's granddaughter is June Sondels.
Yes.
Right. Bob Mackey's granddaughter, and he had some daughters, didn't he, and some sons?
He had 3 daughters, and there was Ed Mackey and Bill Mackey, and I think there was only Albert Mackey, and then the 2 older girls, I forget who they were, and then there was Glenna. She married a Mung.
Right.
And then there was another daughter, a younger daughter, that she was...
How about Grace?
No, that was a different family.
Oh, was that a different family?
Bob Mackey used to raise berries, the same as my dad. And so then you went down the hill, And there's where Grace Mackey lived.
Oh, Grace Mackey lived right there.
Yes. And
Grace had sisters too, didn't she?
yes, she did, but I can't tell you their names. They were older, and
Right.
so then there was the old schoolhouse,
The number 11 schoolhouse.
the number 11 schoolhouse, and people by the name of
Dar.
moved in there.
Dar had a daughter, Naomi.
Naomi, she's still living.
Naomi's still living. She married Slim Jackson or Jim Jackson. Jim Jackson died at a very early age in 1937, I believe, or 38.
That's
And
right.
then Naomi Dar married
Carl
Troke.
Kine.
She married Troke Baum first.
Yes.
Troke Baum, and then he died. And then she married
Carl Kine.
Carl Kine, and he died. Is that right?
Right.
And by coincidence, her one daughter, Marietta Jackson, married a man by the name of Kimes. But she married the Kimes before Naomi married Kime. And then she had another daughter, Lois.
See, that was after my time in Silver Creek.
Right.
And then we go back to the other side. I passed the paper down farther to George Lozier
On the right, on the other side of the road.
on the other side.
Tell us about George Lozier. What was his profession?
I can't tell you.
I believe he was a carpenter, wasn't he?
I believe you're right.
Yeah, he was a carpenter. And who lived with him? His in-laws or something? Or
No, he had some in-laws that lived down on the Silver Creek Road,
and who were they? The
Boyles.
Boyles.
And I passed the paper there. And then beyond that was the Sodders home.
Okay, Bus Sodders.
Bus Sodders and the one they called Biggie
Biggie Sodders. Right.
and Clara Sodders.
Clara.
And
Clara married Nichols. Clara Nichols then. She lived in Barberton.
I believe you're true.
Right.
It's, then I never passed the paper there. I went as far as George Lozier. Then coming back was the Kyle farm.
Kyle Farm.
And
What's there right now, Kenny?
I can't tell you.
Yeah. Now, incidentally, when you passed papers there, that you've mentioned only about 10 houses, but that's about 2 miles or better, isn't it? So you had a good hike between houses.
Well, then coming back at Kyle farm, and then later on, Ori Kale moved in there.
Ori Kale has a huge family too.
Right.
Mostly girls, but he did have a couple boys, didn't he?
He had a boy named Bill.
Bill Kale, and
Bill
he had a son named Bill also.
Yes, he did.
And then, what were some of the girls' names? Ellen, I believe, and Eunice, and some of the other ones?
Eunice, and one was in my class at school.
Remember her name, Kenny?
Audrey.
Audrey.
And she married a Toombs.
Right. And Eunice married Minnick,
Right.
and Ellen married Pollock.
Yes.
And whom else do we remember from down there? This is really, really great because we've not had this kind of articulation of all of the people. And of course, a paper boy would know.
Well, then I passed the paper on down to the Myers family.
Myers.
And then up Homestead Road, there was a,
Now, Homestead Road, you would be crossing Silver Creek Road going west.
no, that was off of Johnson Road going up.
True, but I mean, from where you were, from the Myers farm,
Yes, you'd go
you go straight
north,
west.
straight south. The road ran right along the Myers house,
Which road?
Hempstead.
Homestead Road.
Homestead.
But I'm saying that Homestead Road is off Johnson Road.
Right.
But you were, from George Lozier's house, you would have to cross Silver Creek Road,
Right.
then on down Johnson, and then you go about a half mile or better, and then you turn south or left onto Homestead. And how
Right.
many houses were on there, and who lived there?
There weren't too many. There was a fella that I passed the paper to for a while. His name was Days. And I don't remember any of his family, But they didn't take the paper very long. And coming down, then many times, why, when I rode my bicycle, I would come back to Silver Creek Road that goes south and pass the paper to home back along the old branch track on the left-hand side. This is coming back. The people that lived there first, they didn't take the paper, and I don't know who they were. But then the Dean family moved in
lived
there.
down there. Big family.
Yes, they had only one boy, Richard, and then they had Mary Louise and Alice and Beverly and Lois, and there's one more, but
There are about 6 kids altogether, as I remember.
Then I come back.
Now, when you talk about the branch railroad that went down there, that's the one that came from the number 3 mine that was going down to Doylestown, or was that going all the way up to Louis Thomas's farm?
Well, that was the one that probably went down to Doylestown, but there was never any action from the time that we moved there. All of those coal cars sat along the track there.
Just rusting away.
Rusting away, and of course, back of where Chuck Long lived later on in the Dean house, that used to flood over. It was a swampy part.
Mm-hmm. It'd be called wetlands now, but it's a swamp then.
And it would rain and it would freeze over, and we would skate there.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And to make a fire real fast, we'd take the waste out of the hot boxes, and it would burn real fast.
Now, you're going to have to tell us what hot boxes are, because most people won't know. The hot boxes are from the railroad cars. And what was the material in the hot boxes?
Well, it was waste, and it was packed with grease and oil.
In other words, it was kind of a heavy packing.
That was a packing.
And you would take that off the hot box, which of course was illegal as heck.
Oh, yes.
And if they ever got caught, you'd get burned for it. But it did burn instantly, didn't it?
Oh, yes.
And make a hot fire. Mm-hmm. And you didn't have to worry about drowning or anything of this nature, because actually you were on a very shallow water. Just was a swamp frozen over.
It was just covered. It covered all the shrubs and everything,
Right.
or the outgrowth, and many times.
Now that's immediately south of the railroad track, right?
Right.
And there's a landfill there now, but it's immediately south of the railroad track.
That was the ball field.
The ball
The
field.
Silver Creek ball field.
Who played in the ball field?
Well, I was bat boy, and everybody met at John Mulaney's.
And where did John Mulaney live?
John Mulaney lived on the south. Well,
Northwest
coming
corner.
back, it would be the
Northwest corner
northwest corner.
of Silver Creek and Silver Crest.
Right.
Mhm.
And they would meet there every Sunday morning and or Sunday afternoon. And Bud Mulaney, he would come from, he worked away from home.
What was Bud's real name? Do you remember?
Bernard,
Bernard Mulaney. And whose son was he?
that was John. And
John Mulaney. And John was the owner of the number 3 coal mine.
No, yes.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And he had a son named John. They
Right.
called him Mac.
Mac Mulaney. Mm-hmm.
And then there was Eddie Mulaney and Charlie Mulaney and Mary.
Mary Mulaney, who was married Mary Huffman
Huffman.
now. Mm-hmm.
And we would meet there. And Bud Mulaney had an old Mormon touring car. And we always went up to Marty Marin's on Durling Drive to pick up Marty.
Okay, now describe that Mormon touring car. That was not a religion, was it? The Mormon touring car. That was the name of the car, correct?
Right.
Because in those days there were over 3,000 different makes of cars. Of course, we don't have that many makes now because they've all consolidated. But the Mormon touring car, would you explain it, what year it was, what it looked like, and so
I
forth?
can't tell you what year it was, but it was a great big car. Well, anyway, it had enough room in there in the back end. It was a wide seat, and you could stand in there, and people sitting on the seat, and then in the front they'd haul 3 people, and Bud always drove. And I remember one time I went up to get Marty Marin, and Bud cut it too short, and he hit the house.
Wow.
And
Marty Marin lived on the corner of Durling Drive, the first house on the left as you start up on Durling Drive.
right. And Mac Mullaney was Marty's brother-in-law, and he lived upstairs for quite a while.
Mac married a Marin girl, didn't he?
Yes.
Mhm.
And, well, they played ball down there about every Sunday, and I don't know who it was that they had a tent, and they sold all kind of pop. And I remember one fellow that used to come down there, and they sold Whistle, Green River, and the other pops, but he always drank Green River. His name was Shrimplin.
Shrimplin.
Shrimplin. They lived on State Street.
Do you know his first name?
No, I don't remember.
But he lived on State Street in Wadsworth.
Yes.
And he had Green River pop.
Yeah.
What was it? Was it actually green, or was it just the name Green River?
I think it was a little bit green, and
Yeah.
so then the people that played on the baseball team, I can name quite a few of them.
That's wonderful. Let's hear those.
Jake Mackey was the catcher, and he was something else. He had a tryout with the Cleveland Indians, but
Oh, really?
Jake had a little problem
Okay.
drinking,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't stay very long.
Mm-hmm.
But he was the catcher. Marty Marin used to pitch, and Jimmy McDermott played.
And where did the McDermotts live at that time?
They lived just about across from John Mullaney.
Right. Mhm.
He was the first house after passing
Tommy
Jones.
Jones's house. And Tommy lived on the corner.
Right.
Right now, there's another house before where Tommy Jones lived. But Tommy Jones lived on the corner, and then there was Jim McDermott was next. Now, Jim McDermott had a daughter who is Betty McDermott.
Right.
Remember her? Whom did she marry?
She married a McIlvaine.
McIlvaine. And who are the descendants of that union in Wadsworth?
Well, the older girl, Bill Mullaney, or
Bill McDermott.
Bill McDermott lives in Wadsworth.
Bill himself, that's the oldest boy.
Right.
But he's not the oldest son, or oldest child.
No.
Eileen,
Eileen was the oldest, then Betty,
Betty, and then
and Bill, and then there was,
Kathleen.
Kathleen, and then there was Rosemary.
I don't know Rosemary.
No, Rosemary died.
Oh, she died. That's why I don't
When
know
she
her.
was a baby, she had leakage of the heart.
I see.
And while I passed papers, I used to drop in and see her. She was bedfast.
How old would she be now?
Well, I can't tell you. She was about 3 then, or 4.
Was she younger than Kathleen?
Yes.
Kathleen would be 71 or so, 70 years older now, 70 years
No,
old.
she'd be a little bit older then.
Okay.
Kathleen was the last one, I
Okay,
think.
Kathleen was the last one. Mhm.
And
Well, do you remember who Eileen, you say Eileen married we all have the same problem. As we get older, we forget things from one minute to the next. The McIlvaine. Was it Rex McIlvaine that she married?
Oh, Betty married Rex McElvain.
Okay, and Rex McElvain was what in Wadsworth for the longest time?
Well, he taught school and he was
Athletic director.
coach and
Right.
athletic.
Now,
director.
they have some children. Who are their children?
I can't tell you.
What about the McElvain boys in town, one of whom is a judge right now? Now, how are they related?
Well, their dad was Earl McElvain,
And they are
Earl's boys.
Earl's boys, but and Earl was a brother of Rex, is that right?
Right. He was the older brother.
Okay, of Rex. So there's a relationship.
Right. And Eileen McDermott, she married Jack Kunkler.
Jack Kunkler, right.
And the other players that were on the team, Johnny Long played.
John was a brother of Chuck Long.
Yes.
An older brother, wasn't he not?
No, Chuck was older than
Oh, was that
John.
right? And their father's name was Norm
Norm Long.
Long.
And they had a sister, Ethel,
Ethel?
and they had a younger sister,
Betty.
Betty, and the older
Letha
sister.
was a real name, though.
Letha. And the older sister, I forget her name. But I knew the Long family, and old man Haji, he used to pitch ball.
Mr. Hodge, was that be Bill Hodge, right?
Well, Bill was the stepson.
No, I mean the old man Hodge, the one who came from England. He pitched ball,
Yeah.
and he wasn't his name Bill?
I can't tell you. I always called him Old Man Hodge.
Right. I think his name was Bill, though. I don't think any mother would name her child Old Man.
And he was a pretty good pitcher until they caught on to him.
What was that?
Well, one time they were playing a team, and he was throwing a curve that nobody could hit, and then he'd throw different kind of balls, and this guy got wise to him, and he went out, and Haji had some rubber bands around his fingers, which was illegal.
Oh.
And then after they took the rubber bands away from him, he
Couldn't pitch too well.
No, he couldn't pitch too well.
He had 3 sons too, didn't he, and a daughter?
Well, from his first wife, he had Reg was the
Reginald?
oldest, and then Sam,
Well,
and Ian.
Then Ian.
And the first Mrs. Hodge was killed.
And how did that happen?
They lived over on Manchester Road, on the railroad that runs across, and Mrs. Hodge was carrying Ian. And she waited for the train to go and waited, and she wanted to get on the other side. So she started to crawl underneath. She was carrying Ian, and the train started up, and Sam had his feet on the track, and it cut both feet off, and she was killed, and she throwed Ian out.
Wow.
So that's how that happened. And then Haji married a lady by the name of Mary Bowman. And she had a son, Bill Bowman. We called him Sugar Bill.
Sugar Bill. Why did we call him Sugar Bill?
It beats me.
Seems that he was on the streetcar coming from Barberton carrying a 5-pound bag of sugar, and the bag broke, and he ate all of the sugar before he got home, so they called him Sugar Bill. That's what I've heard. I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, they lived there quite a while, and then Mrs. Hodge, Mary, died. I know she used to make pies, and she would offer me pie, and I never cared for it.
And that wasn't very good?
And so Then she died, and he went to Tennessee, and he picked up Mrs. Harris.
Mrs. Harris, who had 2 children.
3.
3? Okay.
Carl
Linda,
and the girl, I forget.
Linda.
And then Chuck Harris. And then later on, they had a boy, Bob Hodges.
Who still lives in Wadsworth.
He still lives in Wadsworth. And the other ball players down there were, well, all the Mulaney's played, and the Mackeys played.
And what about the Hutchisons?
And Bill Hutchison played, Mike's boy. And then there was another Bill Hutchison that belonged to Butch Hutchison.
Do you remember Butch's real name?
Bill.
Bill?
William Hutchison. And he had 3 boys and 1 girl, Anna, and Pinky, or Paul, and Emmett.
And they were twins, weren't they?
They were twins. They weren't identical.
No.
And so then Bill, the older boy, he was a big fella, and I think it was...
Well, all of the Hutchisons were big.
And
I mean, the boys, the men.
so Bill and I think it was a Stall, and I forget the other names, but there were 2 or 3 of those fellows were playing basketball up at the gym and at the match.
At the match gym. There used to be a gym at the match. We'll have to hear about that, too.
Oh, yes. And they were drinking water out of a fountain that they shouldn't have been drinking out of, and they got typhoid fever.
Wow.
And 2 of the boys, Bill Hutchison and I think it was the Stall, died.
Wow.
And Bill was married to the Lair girl, Raul Lair's daughter, Catherine Lair.
Catherine Lair.
No, I'll take that back. Catherine was married to a Stall.
Okay.
And Gertrude, he had another daughter, Gertrude, she went to school with me. And,
Gertrude Lair.
yes, and she married a fellow that was a jeweler over at Creston.
I see.
That's where she lived. So then, all of the baseball players, I can't name all of them,
We've done a good job, though. We've been naming a lot of them.
but I remember one day, one Sunday, there was a colored fellow that was standing there watching the ball game. And not too old a fella. And pretty soon the passenger train was coming up from down towards Rittman. And he stood as real close to the track that he could, and he got on that train.
While it was going. Wow.
And he stood in between the cars on the coupling. But I thought that was fantastic that
He
it
could
was
do
going,
that. He
going.
probably had a lot of practice in doing something like that.
And so then we can get back to, we can go either side of the street that you want to, up Silver Creek Road.
Well, let's do that right now.
All right, we'll start with Jimmy McDermott.
Okay, that was the second house up on the south side of the road.
Right. And then the next house was Mrs. Amwig,
Maud Amwig and a son, Sam.
Chuck Amwig.
Sam Stanley.
Sam Stanley, we called him Chuck Amwig.
But his real name was Stanley, though,
Right,
because that was her second husband.
right.
Bill Amwig was her son, right?
She had a boy, and his name, I can't give you his true name, but we called him Squirt Amwig.
Squirt Amwig.
And then the next house was built, I believe, by the Mager family.
Bill Mager, right.
No, it was Sidney
Sid
Mager.
Sid Mager, okay.
And Sid had two boys at the time, and then they moved into Wadsworth for a short time, and then they moved to,
West of Wadsworth.
Seville.
Seville.
And then Sid, the boy, Sid Mager, and Don Mager were born right there in Silver Creek.
Right.
And then Bruce, he was born in,
Seville or
I
Wadsworth?
can't say whether he was born in Wadsworth or Seville, but then Bobby came along, and I think he was born in Seville.
Seville.
And then we move on up to the next house with Mike Hutchison.
Mike Hutchison.
And
Then Mike sold that to his brother-in-law, Wiedemann, right? Rummy Wiedemann?
Wiedemann married a Florence
Florence Hutchison.
Hutchison. And Mamie Hutchison, I forget what her husband's name was, and then there was Edna,
Edna Hutchison, right.
and then Bill Hutchison. And then on up the road, later on, there was a house built, and Willis Aston lived there.
Right. Now, Willis Aston is the one that I was saying earlier, lived with George Mager,
George Lozier.
or George Lozier, I mean. Is that right?
Right, that's right. That was, she was, or he was a brother to Mrs. Lozier.
That's right, right. So there's an in-law there living with them
came
together,
back.
right.
And then Aston had a boy and a girl,
And he still lives in Wadsworth.
right? Both of them do.
Right, both of them. As a matter of fact, Virginia Aston, the girl, married Emmett Hutchison.
Right.
Of course, Emmett died. And Jack Aston, we used to call him Bertie Aston, lives on Durling Drive.
Right. Then you went on to George Long,
George Long, right.
and he had a picket fence around in the front. And he was related to Norm Long.
Right.
And then you go on to the next place was the Browse home.
Browse.
And John Browse, he gave all kind of lessons, piano, string instruments.
Violin. My eldest brother took his first violin lesson from him, and he went on to be a very fine violinist. Of course, he was wounded in the service, but he was a fine violinist.
And he had a daughter, I forget her name, but she married a preacher. His name was Mitchell.
Mitchell.
And they had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl.
Now, who was Avon Browse?
Avon was John's son, and Juanita.
Juanita Browse was the daughter.
So the Mitchells came there to live for a short time, and Carson and I think it was Dwayne and Mary, they went to school up centralized school on a kid bus with me. So, or with all of us, and then Carson, very intelligent, and so was Mary. I didn't know much about Dwayne, he was younger. Carson became a doctor.
Oh, really?
Up in, he located up around San Francisco.
Oh, boy.
And Mary and the mother, and Dwayne, I think when he grew up, he moved over in towards Pennsylvania. And then Mary and her mother were living in California. And Mary, I forget the man's name that she married, but he had something to do with one of the prisons out in California. And he and Mary lived at this prison. And then Mary and he divorced.
I see.
And Mary went to school with my wife and my sister Mary. She was the same age. Then you moved on to the next property was the Joe Reed
Joe Reed, right.
property.
Quite a cantankerous old man, wasn't he?
He was a comical man.
Yeah.
And he had his one daughter married Frank Leatherman.
Frank Leatherman had a lumber yard, didn't he?
Yes.
Out west of town.
No, it was south of town.
South of town first?
The Wadsworth Lumber.
Oh, yes, right.
That was the
okay.
Wadsworth Lumber Company, and Leatherman, and well, anyway, Joe Reed had a little grocery store in his house. You walked in, and it was petitioned off from the little grocery store. He didn't have much in there, but you could get a loaf of bread or a can of beans. And Joe used to haul coal, or old man Reed, Joe Reed, he used to haul coal. He had a little spring wagon. He couldn't even get a half a ton in.
With a horse or?
But he had a horse, and he would deliver coal. And I remember a lot of times. One time he was unloading some coal down at Mulaney's, and I happened to be in the area there, and he used to treat the horse pretty bad.
Oh, is that right?
And the horse, Joe had his back to the horse, and he was bending over, and the horse bit him.
Bit him? Where'd he bite him?
Right on the buttocks.
Right on the buttocks.
So then Joe turned around, he hit the horse with a shovel.
Wow.
The horse went down. He hit the horse right alongside the head, and it got back up. And so then another thing about old Joe Reed, when you got into the streetcar down there at Silver Creek, or Silver Creek, by old, he'd always grab a hold of the railing, and there was a railing this way, and where you went in and where you come out. And he'd grab a hold of that and jump over this other rail.
Why would he do that?
Oh, just to show off, I guess.
But he could jump.
Yeah.
Now, where was you say that there's a streetcar stop, was that down, right on Silver Creek Road?
Right in front of Huey Doyle's store.
Oh, way down there on the other side. And Huey Doyle then had that store down right next to the railroad track.
And next to that was old John Weldy.
John Weldy.
And John had a path from his home going down to the streetcar line. And all along there he had grapes. He had these little raisin grapes.
Right.
They were delicious.
Oh, they were, yeah.
I'd get some of those every time I went down there. And one day John was uptown, and he had a chicken coop in the back.
Down close to the streetcar track, wasn't it?
Close to the streetcar track, and he was uptown, and he found an ostrich egg. Where it came from, I'll never know, but John brought it home, and he put it in the chicken coop in the nest where they laid the eggs. And I just happened to be passing my paper there. He couldn't hear a thing.
That was hard of hearing?
Oh, yes, and Mrs. Weldy, she couldn't hear.
Mm-hmm.
They were reading lips most of the time. And anyway, she went down to gather the eggs, and I happened to be there when she come up. And she said, "My God, John, look at this." He was always pulling something on her. So then the next house, there was a Snyder family lived there, right on the verge of the hill where you went back to Huey Doyle's store.
Was that where Mark Ryder then lived later?
Mark Ryder lived there later. He built a home there. But originally, Mark lived in a big house down on the other side between the railroad and the streetcar line.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
There was a big home there. And at one time, I think when the coal miners were around, they used to have a big room up there that they called the ballroom, and they would have dances. And then, of course, there was Huey Doyle's grocery store.
Where was Huey? Was a spot? Tell us exactly where Huey's grocery store was.
Well, the Ryder house, the big house, was on the east side, and then on the west side, and on the east side was Huey Doyle's store, and they lived there.
There was a right as you come down the hill from Joe Reed's house.
From the Snyder home.
Right, from the Snyder home. Mm-hmm.
And it was on the left then when you got down there and you crossed the streetcar track.
Across the streetcar track.
Right,
That's where the store was?
right. It was in between the railroad
On the streetcar.
and the
That's the first
streetcar
time we've heard that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Huey worked on the railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And his wife, Louise, she took care of the store. And they had quite a variety of canned goods and bread. And he had a pool table in there. And then Louise, they had, their children were Eileen and Doris and Joe and Rosemary.
And those were what family again?
That was his family, or the Doyle family.
The Doyle family. Mm-hmm.
And when Louise died,
Is Eileen still living?
oh yes, they all went to school with us on the school bus, all but Rosemary. She was the baby when Louise died. And some of them, well, let's see, Rosemary and Joe, and I think Doris, for a while they lived with the Kunkler family at South Main Street.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Mr. and Mrs. Kunkler
Was Eileen born down there?
at Silver Creek, I believe, and Joe and Doris. Well, I think they were all born in Silver Creek.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so then Mark Ryder built that house, and they had a barn in behind the house.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And Mrs. Ryder had a great big white horse. Her name was Flory.
Mrs. Ryder's horse was Flory. Mm-hmm.
And she used to use it in her garden and everything, and
The garden was right west of her house.
right below her house.
Oh, below? Okay. Mm-hmm.
And one day when I come down there to take the paper down to Huey's, Mrs. Ryder was standing out there, and she said, "Kenny, my horse is down and it won't get up." Well, I didn't know what to do, and I told her, I said, "Well, you go call Doc Hamilton."
Who was Doc Hamilton?
Doc Hamilton lived up on Durling Drive, about where the Haynes family lived,
Okay.
and he was a veterinarian. So she called and I stayed with the horse, and it wasn't too long till Doc Hamilton was down there. It didn't take him very long. And he said, Ken, he said, hand me that pitchfork. So I handed him the pitchfork, and on a horse, up above the hoof, there's just like a half moon, and that's very tender. And he took that pitchfork and he just touched that, and the horse jumped up. And I think that he said then that the horse had colic.
Colic.
So then there was no road around this side of the car track at that time. You went down over the streetcar track and you went down to what they call Thomastown.
And where was Thomastown?
Well, that was right along the railroad track. Henry Kaler and Mary Kaler lived on the corner.
Right.
And the next house was a fellow by the name of Baker.
Baker.
And
This is right along the track now.
right north of the railroad track.
In other words, there was no connection between Silver Creek Road and Durling Drive. That big curve didn't
No,
exist
it
then.
didn't exist.
You just went straight over. That road is still there,
Right,
but that was the road.
right. And we'll come back to this story about the land in between. The next house was the John Mulaney, or John Hutchison.
John Hutchison house, right.
And Catherine and Red Hutch, Big Red,
Big Red.
and then she had another.
What was Red's real name?
I think it was John.
John?
And then they had another daughter that was married to a fellow by the name of Halvey.
Right.
And they had a son, Don Halvey.
Don Halvey, right.
And John had a Ford agency over in Doylestown. And he was the mechanic and everything else. And Big Red, he played football at the high school, and then he went on to Heidelberg. And then the next house was William Hutchison.
Will Hutchison, right.
That's where, well, we called him Pinky and
Pinky and Everett, or rather Emmett.
Emmett and Anna.
Anna and Catherine.
And, no,
No. Catherine was a different story.
Catherine was John's
Right.
daughter. And then Anna was William Hutchison.
She
So
married
then
a Plunkett. She married Frank Plunkett.
Frank Plunkett,
They're both dead now.
yes. Frank worked at the Firestone.
Right.
Then the next house was Nick Ryder.
Nick Ryder.
It was Mark Ryder's brother. And there was, they had, Mrs. Ryder was a Flickinger. She came from Canal Fulton, where my
Okay.
mother did. And then they had Margaret. That was Nick's first wife. And then Nick and Miss Flickinger were married, and they had, let's see, 1, 2, 3 girls and a boy. Paul Ryder and Dorothy Ryder and Beulah Ryder, and I forget the next one. I know Mrs. Ryder, when I passed papers, she always had cookies for me. So did Mrs. Kaler.
Right. Mary
I
Kaler.
never had to eat supper when
Well, I would imagine not. You know, Kenny, we're out of time, but we're going to have you come back again because we aren't even through your paper route, and we haven't even touched upon the rest of your life. So we're going to say goodbye this time, just for the moment, and we'll have you back again because we'll start at the Ryder's farm house keep on going, finish your paper route, and then tell us everything that you've done in the city. Thanks a million, Kenny. We appreciate what you're
Okay.
being here.
Thanks for being here.